October 31st, 1990, Millbrook, Connecticut. The autumn air carried the excitement of Halloween through the quiet streets of Millbrook, a peaceful suburban town in Connecticut, where neighbors knew each other by name and children played freely in tree-lined yards. October 31st, 1990, began like any other Halloween in this close-knit community, with families preparing costumes and carved pumpkins glowing on doorsteps. By nightfall, groups of children in colorful disguises filled the sidewalks, their laughter echoing between houses decorated with cobwebs and plastic skeletons. Nobody could have imagined that before the night ended, one of their own would vanish without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt Millbrook for years to come. 9-year-old Sophia Carter had spent weeks perfecting her witch costume, complete with a black pointed hat, a purple cape her mother Catherine had sewn by hand, and bright red shoes that clicked against the pavement as she walked. Sophia was a cheerful fourth grader at Millbrook Elementary School, known for her infectious smile and love of drawing. That evening, she left her home on Oak Street at approximately 6:30, joining a group of 5 neighborhood children ranging in ages from 8 to 11. The group included her best friend Emma Thompson, along with 3 boys from their school. Parents had agreed the children could trick-or-treat together within a 4-block radius, staying in well-lit areas and returning home by 8 o'clock. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. The evening progressed normally as the children made their way through the designated route, filling their plastic pumpkin buckets with candy from friendly neighbors. Multiple witnesses would later confirm seeing the group moving systematically from house to house, laughing and comparing their growing collections of treats. At approximately 7:15, the children reached the corner of Maple Street and Birch Avenue, an area that marked the edge of their allowed territory. This intersection held particular significance because directly across the street stood the old Morrison property, a large Victorian house that had been abandoned for nearly 3 years since the elderly owners passed away. The deteriorating structure, with its overgrown yard and boarded windows, had become a source of neighborhood speculation and ghost stories among local children. What happened next would be reconstructed through fragmentary testimonies from the other children, each offering pieces of a puzzle that investigators would struggle to complete. According to their accounts, Sophia became separated from the group somewhere near the Morrison property. The exact circumstances remained unclear, with conflicting reports about whether she wandered off independently or responded to something that caught her attention. Emma Thompson, the last person to see Sophia, would later tell investigators that her friend mentioned seeing something interesting near the old house, but provided no specific details about what had drawn her attention. Within minutes, the other children realized Sophia was no longer with them and began calling her name, searching the immediate area with growing panic. By 7:45, when Sophia failed to respond to their calls, the children made the decision to alert adults. They ran to the nearest house, belonging to the Patterson family, where the parents immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. Multiple neighbors joined the search, combing through yards and calling Sophia's name into the darkness. At 8:10, Catherine and Robert Carter received the phone call every parent dreads, informing them their daughter had gone missing. The Carters immediately drove to the search area, with Robert contacting the Millbrook Police Department while Catherine organized additional volunteers from among their friends and neighbors. Detective James Sullivan, a 20-year veteran of the police force, arrived on scene at 8:30 and immediately established a command center in the Pattersons' living room. Sullivan was known throughout the department as a methodical investigator who approached cases with careful attention to detail. He began by interviewing the children who had been with Sophia, documenting their movements throughout the evening and identifying the exact location where they last saw her. Officers spread throughout the neighborhood, knocking on doors and questioning residents about anything unusual they might have observed. The initial search focused on the immediate area around Maple Street and the Morrison property, with officers using flashlights to examine yards, garages, and any structures where a child might have taken shelter or become trapped. As the search expanded, the Morrison house became a focal point of investigative attention. Despite the property being secured with padlocks and boards covering most entrances, officers conducted a thorough external inspection, searching for any signs of forced entry or disturbance. The overgrown vegetation surrounding the house created numerous hiding spots and made the search challenging in darkness. K-9 units were called in, and tracking dogs were given items of Sophia's clothing to establish her scent. The dogs showed interest in several areas around the Morrison property, but failed to establish a clear trail leading away from the location. At approximately 11:30 that night, an officer conducting a grid search of the Morrison property's backyard made a discovery that transformed the case from a missing child to something far more sinister. Partially concealed beneath a pile of fallen leaves near the property's rear fence, investigators found a single red shoe, identical to the ones Sophia had been wearing as part of her witch costume. The shoe showed no signs of damage and appeared to have been recently placed in that location rather than having been there for an extended period. More disturbing was the absence of any other evidence in the immediate vicinity. No torn fabric, no signs of struggle, no additional belongings. Just one shoe sitting alone in the darkness, as if carefully positioned for someone to find. This discovery indicated that Sophia had definitely been in that location, but it raised more questions than it answered about what had happened to her and where she might be now. November 1990, Millbrook, Connecticut. The discovery of Sophia Carter's red shoe in the backyard of the abandoned Morrison property transformed the investigation from a search and rescue operation into a potential abduction case. Detective James Sullivan assembled his team at the Millbrook Police Department headquarters early on the morning of November 1st, less than 12 hours after Sophia's disappearance. The detective understood that the first 48 hours of any missing child case were critical, and precious time had already elapsed. Sullivan divided his investigative team into specialized units, assigning officers to canvass the neighborhood, review any available security footage, and conduct detailed interviews with every resident within a half-mile radius of where Sophia was last seen. The Morrison property underwent extensive forensic examination throughout the following days. Crime scene technicians processed the entire grounds, collecting soil samples, footprint impressions, and any trace evidence that might provide clues about Sophia's fate. The house itself, despite being locked and boarded, was systematically searched from attic to basement. Investigators discovered that while the main entrances remained secured, a basement window at the rear of the property had a loose board that could be moved aside, creating an opening large enough for a person to squeeze through. This finding suggested someone had been accessing the abandoned house, though whether this related to Sophia's disappearance remained unclear. Inside, officers found evidence of recent human presence, including discarded food wrappers, empty water bottles, and areas where dust had been disturbed, indicating someone had walked through the rooms within recent weeks. The neighborhood canvass revealed information that began to paint a more complex picture of the community. Millbrook had always prided itself on being a safe, family-oriented suburb where children could play freely and neighbors looked out for one another. However, as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered undercurrents of concern that some residents had harbored but never formally reported. Multiple neighbors mentioned Gregory Palmer, a 42-year-old man who lived alone in a modest ranch house on Cedar Lane, approximately 3 blocks from where Sophia disappeared. Palmer had moved to Millbrook 8 years earlier and worked as a freelance computer technician, a profession that allowed him to maintain an irregular schedule and limited social interaction with the community. Several parents disclosed to investigators that they had felt uncomfortable with Palmer's behavior around children, though they struggled to articulate specific incidents that would justify their unease. One mother recalled Palmer offering candy to children from his front porch during previous Halloweens, standing in his doorway longer than seemed normal and asking questions about where the children lived and attended school. Another neighbor reported seeing Palmer watching from his window as children played in the street, sometimes using binoculars that he claimed were for bird watching. A father mentioned that Palmer had once approached his daughter at a neighborhood garage sale, engaging her in conversation and asking to take her photograph with a Polaroid camera he carried, a request that was declined. These observations, individually minor, collectively suggested a pattern of concerning behavior that warranted serious investigative attention. Detective Sullivan obtained a warrant to search Gregory Palmer's residence on November 8th, citing the proximity of his home to the disappearance site and the multiple reports of unusual behavior around children. The search team arrived at Palmer's house early in the morning, finding the suspect at home and cooperative, though visibly nervous about the police presence. Officers conducted a methodical search of every room, examining closets, drawers, and storage areas for any evidence connecting Palmer to Sophia's disappearance. In a locked filing cabinet in Palmer's home office, investigators made a disturbing discovery that elevated him to the status of primary suspect. The cabinet contained 3 photo albums filled with pictures of children from the neighborhood, dozens of images captured over several years. Many photographs showed children playing in yards, riding bicycles, or walking to school, apparently taken without the knowledge or consent of the subjects or their parents. Among these photographs were several images of Sophia Carter, including recent pictures that appeared to have been taken during the months leading up to her disappearance. The photos showed Sophia walking home from school, playing in her front yard, and sitting on her porch reading. Palmer had organized the albums with meticulous care, labeling each photograph with dates and locations. Also found were notebooks containing detailed observations about various children's routines, including the times they left for school, routes they traveled, and activities they participated in after classes ended. Gregory Palmer was brought to the police station for questioning, where he spent 6 hours being interviewed by Detective Sullivan and other senior investigators. Palmer maintained his innocence throughout the interrogation, insisting that his photography was merely a hobby and that he meant no harm to any children. He claimed his interest was artistic in nature and that he enjoyed capturing candid moments of neighborhood life. When confronted with the specific focus on children rather than adults or other subjects, Palmer became defensive, stating that children represented innocence and joy, themes he found photographically compelling. Regarding the detailed notes about children's schedules and activities, Palmer offered no satisfactory explanation, eventually asserting his right to remain silent and requesting an attorney. Despite the suspicious nature of Palmer's collection and the clear violation of privacy it represented, investigators faced a significant challenge. Nothing in Palmer's possession directly connected him to Sophia's disappearance. No items belonging to Sophia were found in his home. No witnesses had placed Palmer near the Morrison property on Halloween night. His photographs, while deeply troubling, did not constitute evidence of abduction or harm. Forensic analysis of Palmer's vehicle revealed no traces of Sophia's DNA or any physical evidence suggesting she had been inside it. The legal threshold for charging Palmer with Sophia's disappearance had not been met, though police maintained close surveillance on him as the investigation continued. Meanwhile, Catherine and Robert Carter made the difficult decision to go public with their daughter's case, appearing on local and national news programs to appeal for information. They offered a substantial reward for any information leading to Sophia's safe return, funded through contributions from the Millbrook community and family savings. The media coverage generated hundreds of tips from across the country, each requiring investigation and verification. Most leads proved unfounded, consisting of mistaken sightings or well-intentioned but inaccurate information. The Carter family established a command center in their home, coordinating with volunteers who continued searching wooded areas, drainage systems, and abandoned structures throughout the region. As November progressed, Detective Sullivan expanded the investigation beyond Gregory Palmer, recognizing that tunnel vision on a single suspect could allow the true perpetrator to evade justice. Officers re-interviewed everyone who had participated in Halloween activities that night, seeking details that might have seemed insignificant initially, but could prove crucial upon closer examination. One such interview, conducted on November 23rd, provided a new direction for the investigation. Victoria Hayes, a 78-year-old widow who lived directly across from the Morrison property, mentioned a detail she had not included in her initial statement to police on Halloween night. Mrs. Hayes explained that while sitting in her living room that evening, watching television and preparing treats for trick-or-treaters, she had noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked on the street near the Morrison house. The car, which she described as a dark-colored sedan, possibly blue or black, had been parked there for at least 30 minutes before Sophia's disappearance. Mrs. Hayes had found this unusual because the Morrison property generated no regular traffic, and visitors to other homes on that block typically parked in driveways rather than on the street. She recalled that the vehicle's engine appeared to be running, evidenced by exhaust visible in the cool evening air. Mrs. Hayes had assumed the car belonged to parents waiting to pick up their children after trick-or-treating and had not considered it significant until investigators pressed her for any unusual observations from that night. This new information sparked renewed investigative energy. Detective Sullivan immediately recognized that a waiting vehicle suggested premeditation rather than a crime of opportunity. Someone had been positioned near the Morrison property, possibly watching and waiting for the right moment. The detail about the running engine suggested the driver was prepared for a quick departure. Officers returned to the neighborhood, conducting additional interviews specifically focused on the mysterious vehicle. Several other residents confirmed seeing an unfamiliar car in the area that evening, though descriptions varied slightly, and nobody had noted the license plate number. The vehicle became a crucial focus of the investigation, representing a tangible lead that might connect to Sophia's disappearance. As Thanksgiving approached, the Carter family faced the holiday without their daughter, their home filled with missing person flyers instead of festive decorations. Detective Sullivan worked extended hours, pursuing every lead and reviewing evidence repeatedly, searching for connections that might have been overlooked. The investigation had generated thousands of pages of reports, hundreds of witness statements, and numerous potential suspects. Yet Sophia remained missing. The community of Millbrook organized prayer vigils and fundraising events, determined to keep Sophia's case in the public consciousness. But as weeks turned into months with no significant breakthrough, even the most optimistic supporters began to fear that Sophia Carter might never be found. The question that haunted everyone involved was whether the answer had been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for someone to recognize its significance. December 1990 to March 1991. Millbrook, Connecticut. The investigation into Sophia Carter's disappearance entered a frustrating phase as winter descended upon Millbrook. Detective James Sullivan found himself navigating an increasingly complex web of leads that seemed to point in multiple directions simultaneously, each promising breakthrough, ultimately leading to dead ends. The dark-colored sedan that Victoria Hayes had reported seeing near the Morrison property became a primary focus of investigative efforts. Sullivan's team compiled lists of every vehicle matching that general description registered within a 50-mile radius of Millbrook, a task that yielded over 3,000 potential matches. Officers systematically worked through the list, tracking down owners and verifying their whereabouts on Halloween night, a painstaking process that consumed hundreds of investigative hours. Gregory Palmer remained under surveillance, though the lack of direct evidence connecting him to Sophia's disappearance prevented any arrest. Detectives monitored his movements, recorded his phone conversations with judicial approval, and maintained watch on his residence around the clock. Palmer appeared aware of the surveillance and modified his behavior accordingly, limiting his outdoor activities and rarely leaving his home except for essential errands. His photography hobby ceased entirely, the camera that had documented neighborhood children now sitting unused. Legal experts consulted by the department confirmed that while Palmer's photo collection was disturbing, it did not constitute sufficient grounds for prosecution without additional evidence linking him to Sophia or establishing intent to harm. The Christmas season brought renewed media attention to the case as television networks featured year-end stories about unsolved disappearances. Catherine and Robert Carter appeared on national programs, their grief evident as they pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. The reward fund had grown to $50,000 through community donations and contributions from concerned citizens across the country. Tips flooded into the police department, creating an overwhelming volume of information that required careful evaluation. Reports came from various states claiming to have spotted a girl matching Sophia's description, each sighting investigated thoroughly despite the geographic improbability of many accounts. One particularly promising lead emerged in early January when a convenience store clerk in Hartford, Connecticut, contacted police claiming to have seen a girl resembling Sophia in the company of an adult male. Investigators rushed to Hartford, reviewing security camera footage from the store and interviewing the clerk extensively. The grainy video showed a young girl who bore some similarity to Sophia, but forensic analysis ultimately determined it was not her. The child was eventually identified as a Hartford resident whose appearance coincidentally matched Sophia's general features. This pattern repeated itself multiple times throughout the winter months, each potential sighting raising hopes before being definitively ruled out through investigation. Detective Sullivan began to question fundamental assumptions about the case. The initial theory had focused on stranger abduction, possibly by someone like Gregory Palmer, who had demonstrated inappropriate interest in neighborhood children. However, Sullivan recognized that most child abductions fell into different categories, including family abductions or crimes committed by acquaintances rather than strangers. He ordered a comprehensive review of everyone connected to the Carter family, examining relatives, family friends, co-workers of Sophia's parents, and anyone who had regular contact with the household. This expanded investigation revealed no suspicious connections or concerning relationships that might suggest an inside involvement. The Morrison property continued to yield fragments of information without providing definitive answers. In February, during a systematic search of the surrounding area, investigators discovered a torn piece of purple fabric snagged on a chain-link fence approximately 2 blocks from where Sophia's shoe had been found. The fabric matched the material of Sophia's Halloween cape, suggesting she may have traveled through that area either voluntarily or while being transported. This discovery prompted another intensive search of the neighborhood, with particular attention to the route between the Morrison house and the location where the fabric was recovered. Despite these efforts, no additional physical evidence was located. An anonymous phone call received by the police tip line in mid-February provided an intriguing piece of historical information about the Morrison property itself. The caller, who refused to identify themselves, claimed that during the 1970s, the Morrison house had been the subject of neighborhood complaints regarding suspicious activities. According to the caller, unusual sounds had been reported coming from the property late at night, and strangers had been observed coming and going at irregular hours. The caller suggested that investigators should examine whether the property had been used for purposes beyond residential occupation. Detective Sullivan assigned officers to research the Morrison family's history and any records related to complaints or investigations involving their property. The historical research revealed that Edward and Margaret Morrison, the elderly couple who had owned the property, had been private individuals with limited social interaction with neighbors. Edward Morrison had operated a small printing business from a workshop in the home's basement during the 1960s and 1970s, which explained the commercial traffic that had concerned neighbors. City records showed that several noise complaints had been filed during that period, all related to printing equipment operation, and all resolved without incident. The Morrisons had no criminal records, and their property had passed through probate normally after their deaths. While this information provided context, it offered no apparent connection to Sophia's disappearance 13 years after the printing business had closed. As March arrived, bringing the first signs of spring, the investigation reached what appeared to be a complete impasse. Every lead had been exhausted, every suspect scrutinized, every theory tested against available evidence. The Carter family maintained their vigil, but the strain was evident in their haggard appearance and diminished hope. Community support remained strong, though the initial intensity had naturally diminished as months passed without progress. Detective Sullivan refused to let the case go cold, continuing to review files and evidence, searching for the overlooked detail that might unlock the mystery. Then, on March 19th, an unexpected development occurred that would eventually transform the entire investigation. Millbrook Elementary School, the institution Sophia had attended before her disappearance, began a renovation project to modernize facilities and address structural issues in the aging building. Construction workers tasked with updating the school's basement discovered a forgotten storage room that had been sealed behind a wall during previous renovations decades earlier. Inside this abandoned space, covered in dust and seemingly untouched for years, workers found boxes containing outdated school supplies, old yearbooks, broken furniture, and personal items left behind by former staff members. Among these forgotten possessions was a plastic storage container that would prove to contain something far more significant than anyone could have anticipated. The container held Halloween costumes from past school celebrations, teaching materials, and most importantly, a handwritten diary that had been waiting in darkness for someone to discover its secrets and understand the truth it had been silently protecting for years. April 1991, Millbrook, Connecticut. The discovery of the sealed storage room in Millbrook Elementary School's basement initially appeared to be nothing more than an interesting historical find, a time capsule of educational materials and forgotten belongings from previous decades. Construction foreman Michael Thompson had contacted the school administration when workers broke through the wall, uncertain whether the contents had any value or should simply be discarded as part of the renovation process. Principal Laura Bennett examined the materials and recognized that some items, particularly the old yearbooks and photographs, held sentimental and historical significance worth preserving. She arranged for the boxes to be transferred to the school's administrative office, where staff could properly catalog and determine the fate of each item. Among the discoveries was a weathered plastic container labeled with masking tape bearing the name Dorothy Mitchell and the year 1988. Dorothy Mitchell had served as head custodian at Millbrook Elementary for 3 decades before retiring in the spring of that year, just 2 years before Sophia Carter's disappearance. School records indicated that Dorothy had been a beloved fixture of the institution, known for her kindness toward students and dedication to maintaining the facility. Several current staff members remembered her fondly, describing a woman who took genuine interest in the children's welfare and often noticed things that teachers and administrators overlooked due to their focus on academic responsibilities. Principal Bennett opened the container, expecting to find cleaning supplies or maintenance records, but instead discovered neatly folded Halloween costumes, teaching aids for holiday celebrations, and a spiral-bound notebook filled with handwritten entries. The notebook appeared to be a personal journal that Dorothy had maintained during her years at the school, documenting observations, concerns, and reflections about her work environment. Bennett began reading the entries with casual curiosity, but her attention sharpened as she recognized that Dorothy's journal contained far more than routine workplace observations. The custodian had documented behavioral concerns about various staff members, incidents involving students that troubled her, and situations that she felt warranted attention but had been dismissed or ignored by school administration. The principal immediately recognized the potential significance of this discovery, particularly given the unsolved disappearance of a student from the school. She contacted Detective James Sullivan, explaining what had been found and suggesting that the journal might contain relevant information. Sullivan arrived at the school within the hour, accompanied by 2 investigators from his team. They carefully examined the journal, photographing each page for evidence preservation before beginning a detailed analysis of its contents. What they found validated Bennett's instincts about the document's importance and opened an entirely new direction for the investigation that had seemed hopelessly stalled. Dorothy Mitchell's journal entries spanned from 1985 through her retirement in 1988, consisting of hundreds of observations recorded in neat, precise handwriting. The custodian had documented her concerns about various individuals and situations, noting dates, times, and specific behaviors that troubled her. Many entries dealt with routine school matters or minor disciplinary issues, but several passages focused on individuals whose conduct Dorothy found particularly worrying. Among these was a series of entries from the fall of 1990 regarding a substitute teacher named Steven Walsh, who had worked at Millbrook Elementary for approximately 6 weeks during September and October of that year. Dorothy's entries about Steven Walsh began with neutral observations, but quickly took on a more concerned tone. She noted that Walsh, who had been hired to replace a teacher on medical leave, seemed overly interested in learning personal details about students beyond what was necessary for classroom instruction. The custodian recorded instances where she observed Walsh asking children questions about their home lives, their parents' work schedules, and their after-school activities. Dorothy had witnessed Walsh engaging students in conversations during recess and lunch periods, showing particular interest in children who walked home alone or participated in activities without parental supervision. Most troubling were Dorothy's observations that Walsh had been seen photographing students during school events, despite this not being part of his teaching responsibilities. The journal revealed that Dorothy Mitchell had reported her concerns about Steven Walsh to school administrators in October of 1990, just weeks before Sophia Carter's disappearance. She had specifically mentioned Walsh's inappropriate questioning of students and his habit of staying late after school hours, sometimes found in areas of the building where he had no legitimate reason to be present. According to Dorothy's entries, her concerns were acknowledged but not seriously investigated. Administrators had apparently concluded that Walsh was simply an enthusiastic teacher trying to connect with his students, and that Dorothy's concerns reflected generational differences in teaching styles rather than genuine cause for alarm. The substitute teacher completed his 6-week assignment and departed from the school in late October of 1990, shortly before Halloween. Detective Sullivan immediately recognized the significance of this information. A substitute teacher with documented concerning behavior around children, present at Sophia's school during the weeks before her disappearance, had never been identified or investigated because Dorothy Mitchell's concerns had not been elevated to police attention. Sullivan ordered his team to locate comprehensive information about Steven Walsh, including employment history, current whereabouts, criminal background, and any connection to the Morrison property or the neighborhood where Sophia had vanished. The investigation that had been treading water for months suddenly had a concrete direction and a suspect whose profile aligned with classic patterns of child predators who infiltrated institutions with access to potential victims. Research into Steven Walsh's background revealed a troubling pattern that investigators wished had been discovered 6 months earlier. Walsh had no permanent address in Millbrook, having listed a short-term rental apartment on his employment application to the school district. That apartment had been vacated in early November of 1990, just days after Halloween. School district personnel files showed that Walsh had provided minimal documentation when hired, claiming his teaching credentials from another state and offering references that had been checked only superficially during the rushed hiring process to fill the sudden vacancy. Further investigation revealed that Walsh had worked at various schools across Connecticut and neighboring states over the previous 5 years, always in temporary or substitute positions that required minimal background scrutiny and allowed him to move frequently. Financial records subpoenaed by investigators painted a picture of Steven Walsh's activities around the time of Sophia's disappearance. Bank statements showed that Walsh had rented a storage unit in a facility on the outskirts of Millbrook on October 15, 1990, 2 weeks before Halloween. The storage rental continued through November and was paid for 3 months in advance before Walsh stopped payment and the facility eventually auctioned the unit's contents for non-payment. More significantly, property records revealed that Walsh had owned a small house in Millbrook that he purchased in 1989 and sold on November 8, 1990, barely a week after Sophia vanished. The sale price was substantially below market value, suggesting urgency to liquidate the property and leave the area quickly. Detective Sullivan obtained warrants to investigate the storage facility, hoping the unit's contents might still be accessible or that records could identify what Walsh had stored there. Unfortunately, the storage company's policy was to auction unpaid units after 90 days, and Walsh's unit had been sold to a buyer who had cleared out the contents over a year earlier. However, the facility's records included an inventory list created during the auction preparation process. That list mentioned furniture, boxes of personal items, clothing, and miscellaneous household goods. While not detailed enough to identify specific evidence, the inventory confirmed that Walsh had stored a significant volume of belongings, consistent with someone clearing out a residence in preparation for a hasty departure. The next phase of investigation focused on locating Steven Walsh's current whereabouts. Driver's license records showed Walsh had registered a new address in Burlington, Vermont, in December of 1990. Sullivan contacted Vermont State Police and requested assistance in locating and surveilling Walsh, while Connecticut authorities prepared documentation for his arrest. Vermont investigators confirmed that Walsh was indeed residing at the Burlington address and, disturbingly, was employed as a substitute teacher in the Burlington School District under a slightly modified version of his name, using Stephen A. Walsh instead of Steven Walsh. Background checks conducted by the Vermont School District had apparently failed to identify any concerns, allowing Walsh to continue working with children despite whatever role he may have played in Sophia Carter's disappearance. Detective Sullivan assembled a comprehensive case file documenting everything investigators had learned about Steven Walsh, including Dorothy Mitchell's contemporaneous concerns, Walsh's pattern of temporary employment in schools, his sudden departure from Millbrook after Sophia's disappearance, and his current activities in Vermont. On April 26, 1991, Sullivan traveled to Burlington, accompanied by federal agents and Vermont State Police, to execute an arrest warrant for Steven Walsh. The operation was planned carefully to ensure Walsh could not flee or destroy evidence. Officers surrounded his apartment building before dawn, positioning themselves at all exits and establishing a perimeter that would prevent escape. When officers knocked on Walsh's apartment door at 6 in the morning, they identified themselves as police and ordered Walsh to exit peacefully. Instead of complying, Walsh attempted to flee through a rear window, dropping 2 stories to the ground and sprinting toward a parking area where his vehicle was located. Officers who had anticipated this possibility intercepted Walsh before he reached his car, tackling him and securing him in handcuffs despite his continued resistance. Walsh refused to answer any questions during his arrest, repeatedly demanding an attorney and declining to explain his flight attempt or provide any statement about his time in Millbrook. He was transported to Vermont State Police headquarters, where he would be held pending extradition proceedings to return him to Connecticut to face questioning about Sophia Carter's disappearance. The investigation that had seemed hopeless just weeks earlier now had a suspect in custody. But the most crucial question remained unanswered. Where was Sophia? And what had Steven Walsh done to her on that Halloween night 6 months ago? May to August 1991, Connecticut and Vermont. The arrest of Steven Walsh in Burlington, Vermont marked a turning point in the investigation into Sophia Carter's disappearance. But Detective James Sullivan understood that apprehending a suspect was merely the beginning of a complex legal and investigative process. Extradition proceedings were initiated immediately to transfer Walsh from Vermont custody back to Connecticut, where he would face intensive interrogation about his activities during the fall of 1990. Walsh's attorney filed motions to delay the extradition, a common defense tactic that bought time but ultimately could not prevent his return to face questioning. During the 2-week legal process, Connecticut investigators worked to build the strongest possible case by gathering every piece of evidence that might connect Walsh to Sophia's disappearance. The storage unit Walsh had rented in Millbrook became a focal point of renewed investigative attention. Although the unit's contents had been auctioned and dispersed more than a year earlier, Sullivan's team tracked down the individual who had purchased the unit and questioned him about what he had found inside. The buyer, a local antique dealer named Richard Morgan, explained that he regularly purchased abandoned storage units, hoping to find valuable items for resale. Walsh's unit had contained mostly ordinary household furnishings and personal belongings that Morgan had either sold, donated, or discarded based on their condition and market value. However, Morgan had retained several boxes of papers and photographs that he had not yet processed, storing them in his shop's back room with the intention of eventually sorting through them. Detective Sullivan obtained a warrant to search Morgan's antique shop and examine the retained materials from Walsh's storage unit. What investigators discovered among those forgotten boxes provided the evidentiary breakthrough the case desperately needed. The boxes contained hundreds of photographs, many showing children in various settings including schools, playgrounds, and public spaces. The collection included multiple images of Sophia Carter, captured at different times and locations around Millbrook during the months before her disappearance. Some photographs showed Sophia walking to school, others depicted her playing in her yard, and several showed her at the Millbrook Elementary playground during recess periods. The systematic nature of the photography suggested surveillance rather than casual picture-taking, documenting Sophia's routines and habits over an extended period. Even more damning were handwritten notes discovered in the same boxes, consisting of detailed observations about various children, including their names, addresses, school schedules, and family information. Walsh had maintained what investigators recognized as a predator's hunting journal, meticulously recording information about potential victims and their patterns of behavior. The entries about Sophia Carter were particularly extensive, noting that she often walked part of the way home from school with friends before separating to cover the final 2 blocks alone. Walsh had documented that Sophia's parents both worked and that she typically arrived home to an empty house around 3:30 each afternoon. Most significantly, Walsh had made specific notations about Halloween, including the fact that children in Millbrook traditionally trick-or-treated in groups with minimal adult supervision within their immediate neighborhoods. The notebooks also contained references to the Morrison property, which Walsh had apparently identified as an ideal location for his purposes. He had noted that the abandoned house was rarely monitored, that its overgrown vegetation provided concealment, and that the property's position at the edge of a residential block made it accessible from multiple directions. These observations demonstrated premeditation and planning, showing that Walsh had not acted impulsively on Halloween night, but had carefully selected both his victim and the location where he would commit his crime. The discovery of this evidence transformed the case from circumstantial suspicion to substantive proof of Walsh's predatory intent toward Sophia specifically. Forensic analysis of the materials from the storage unit revealed additional crucial evidence. Among Walsh's belongings were items of children's clothing that appeared to be souvenirs or trophies taken from previous victims. DNA testing technology, still relatively new in 1991, was applied to these items in hopes of identifying their origins. While most samples were too degraded to yield useful results, one item provided a match to Sophia Carter through comparison with DNA samples provided by her parents. This physical evidence directly linking Walsh to Sophia represented the strongest proof investigators had obtained, finally providing concrete connection between the suspect and the victim beyond circumstantial observations and suspicious behavior. Armed with this evidence, Detective Sullivan prepared for the interrogation that would occur once Walsh was returned to Connecticut. The strategy involved presenting Walsh with the overwhelming proof of his guilt in stages, beginning with the photographs and notes, then introducing the forensic evidence, finally offering the opportunity for Walsh to provide information about Sophia's location in exchange for consideration during sentencing. Experienced interrogators understood that suspects often maintained denial when confronted with individual pieces of evidence, but sometimes broke when faced with the cumulative weight of multiple proofs of their guilt. The goal was not merely to obtain a confession, but to learn what had happened to Sophia and where her remains might be located, providing the Carter family with closure and the opportunity to properly lay their daughter to rest. Steven Walsh arrived back in Connecticut on May 15th and was immediately transported to a secure interrogation facility where he met with his attorney before facing investigators. The interrogation began the following morning and continued intermittently over 3 days, as Walsh's attorney requested breaks to consult with his client and investigators strategically introduced evidence in calculated sequence. Walsh initially maintained complete denial, insisting that he had nothing to do with Sophia's disappearance and that any evidence suggesting otherwise had been fabricated or misinterpreted. He claimed that his photographs were innocent documentation of community life and that his notes reflected a teacher's professional interest in understanding his students' backgrounds and home environments. This facade of innocence crumbled when investigators presented the forensic evidence linking Walsh to Sophia through DNA analysis. Confronted with scientific proof that he had possessed an item belonging to the missing girl, Walsh's demeanor changed dramatically. He ceased his blanket denials and retreated into silence, refusing to answer questions while repeatedly consulting with his attorney in private. The legal team clearly recognized that the evidence against Walsh was substantial and that conviction was highly probable if the case proceeded to trial. After the 3rd day of interrogation, Walsh's attorney requested a private meeting with prosecutors to discuss the possibility of a plea agreement in exchange for information about Sophia's fate. The negotiations that followed tested Detective Sullivan's professionalism and restraint as he was forced to consider offering concessions to the man responsible for destroying the Carter family. However, the paramount concern was locating Sophia and providing her parents with the ability to properly bury their daughter. Prosecutors agreed to recommend a life sentence with possibility of parole after 30 years rather than pursuing the death penalty, contingent upon Walsh providing truthful and complete information about what had happened to Sophia and where her body could be found. After consulting extensively with his attorney and apparently recognizing that his conviction was inevitable, Steven Walsh accepted the agreement and prepared to reveal the truth about Halloween night 1990. On August 2, 1991, Steven Walsh provided a detailed statement describing how he had lured Sophia Carter to the Morrison property on Halloween night. Walsh admitted that he had been watching Sophia for months after encountering her at Millbrook Elementary, where he worked as a substitute teacher. He had deliberately positioned himself near the Morrison property on Halloween, waiting for the opportunity to separate Sophia from her group. Walsh had called to Sophia from the shadows near the abandoned house, claiming to have special Halloween decorations inside that he wanted to show the children. Sophia, recognizing Walsh as a teacher from her school and therefore perceiving him as a trusted authority figure, had approached to see what he was talking about. Walsh had then convinced her to enter the property, where he overpowered her and prevented her from calling for help or escaping. Walsh provided directions to a remote forested area, approximately 40 miles northeast of Millbrook, describing a specific location where he had concealed Sophia's body in the days following Halloween. He explained that he had kept her restrained at a property he had access to for several days before she died, then had transported her remains to the forest location where he believed they would never be discovered. The details Walsh provided were specific enough that investigators felt confident they could locate the site, finally ending the uncertainty that had tormented the Carter family for 9 months. A recovery team was assembled, including forensic specialists, evidence technicians, and officers who would ensure the scene was properly processed and that Sophia's remains were treated with the dignity and respect she deserved. The grim task of recovering Sophia Carter could finally begin, bringing the investigation toward its painful but necessary conclusion. September 1991 to January 1992. Millbrook, Connecticut. The recovery operation in the remote forest area that Steven Walsh had identified began on August 4, 1991, with Detective James Sullivan leading a team of specialists equipped to handle the sensitive and technically demanding task. The location Walsh had described was situated in a densely wooded region of northeastern Connecticut, far from hiking trails or residential areas, accessible only by logging roads that saw minimal traffic. The isolation of the site explained why Sophia had not been discovered during the extensive searches conducted in the months following her disappearance. Walsh had clearly chosen the location with the intention that his crime would remain forever hidden, burying evidence of his actions where he believed no one would ever think to look. The recovery team worked methodically, establishing a grid system to search the area systematically and ensure no evidence was overlooked. After several hours of careful excavation in the location Walsh had specified, investigators located human remains that were later confirmed through dental records and DNA analysis to be those of Sophia Carter. The discovery brought the 9-month search to a heartbreaking conclusion, transforming the case from a missing child investigation to a confirmed homicide with a suspect already in custody. Detective Sullivan personally contacted Catherine and Robert Carter to inform them of the recovery, a conversation he would later describe as the most difficult of his career. While the Carters had long feared this outcome, the confirmation of their daughter's death marked the end of hope that she might somehow still be alive and returning home. Forensic examination of the recovery site and Sophia's remains provided investigators with evidence supporting the timeline and circumstances Walsh had described in his confession. The findings confirmed that Sophia had died within days of her abduction, sparing her prolonged suffering but offering no comfort to her devastated family. Additional evidence collected at the scene corroborated other details of Walsh's account, lending credibility to his confession and ensuring that his guilty plea would be supported by physical proof rather than relying solely on his word. Prosecutors felt confident that the case against Walsh was ironclad, with confession, physical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis all pointing to his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The Carter family made arrangements to finally lay their daughter to rest, planning a funeral service that honored Sophia's memory and provided the community an opportunity to mourn collectively. The service took place on August 23rd at Millbrook Community Church, attended by hundreds of residents who had supported the family throughout the long months of uncertainty. Dorothy Mitchell, the retired school custodian whose journal had provided the breakthrough in the investigation, attended the service, and spoke briefly with Catherine Carter afterward. The two women embraced, sharing their grief and recognition that Dorothy's attention to concerning behavior and documentation of her observations had ultimately led to justice for Sophia. Dorothy expressed regret that she had not pushed harder for her concerns about Steven Walsh to be taken seriously when he was employed at the school, wondering whether earlier intervention might have prevented the tragedy. Steven Walsh's formal legal proceedings began in September with arraignment on charges including kidnapping, murder, and related offenses. Walsh entered a guilty plea as part of the agreement negotiated with prosecutors, acknowledging his responsibility for Sophia's abduction and death in exchange for the prosecution's recommendation of life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 30 years rather than seeking the death penalty. The plea agreement spared the Carter family the trauma of a lengthy trial, during which they would have been forced to hear detailed testimony about their daughter's final days. While some community members and victims' rights advocates criticized the agreement as too lenient, Catherine and Robert Carter supported the decision, prioritizing closure and certainty over the uncertain outcome of a trial that might have taken years to resolve through the appeals process. The formal sentencing hearing occurred on December 16, 1991, in Connecticut Superior Court. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over the proceeding, which included victim impact statements from Sophia's parents and opportunity for Walsh to address the court before sentencing was imposed. Catherine and Robert Carter delivered emotional statements describing their daughter's vibrant personality, her dreams for the future that would never be realized, and the devastating impact her loss had inflicted on their family and the broader Millbrook community. They emphasized that no punishment could truly balance the scales of justice or restore what had been taken from them, but they found some measure of peace knowing that Walsh would spend the remainder of his life imprisoned and unable to harm other children. Steven Walsh declined to make any statement beyond a brief apology that many observers felt lacked genuine remorse or acceptance of the magnitude of his actions. Judge Morrison delivered a strongly worded condemnation of Walsh's crimes before imposing the agreed-upon sentence of life imprisonment with possibility of parole only after serving 30 years. The judge emphasized that while the plea agreement constrained her sentencing options, she would personally recommend that parole be denied when Walsh eventually became eligible, citing the calculated nature of his crime and his targeting of a vulnerable child. Walsh was immediately remanded to state custody to begin serving his sentence at a maximum security correctional facility, where he would remain segregated from the general prison population due to the nature of his crimes and the likelihood of violence from other inmates. The conclusion of legal proceedings allowed the Carter family to begin the long process of healing and rebuilding their lives in the shadow of their loss. They established the Sophia Carter Memorial Foundation, an organization dedicated to improving child safety education and supporting families of missing children. The foundation funded programs teaching children about recognizing dangerous situations and empowering them to trust their instincts when adults' behavior seemed inappropriate or made them uncomfortable. Catherine Carter became a vocal advocate for more rigorous background check procedures for individuals working with children in schools and other institutional settings, pushing for reforms that would prevent predators like Steven Walsh from exploiting gaps in screening processes to gain access to potential victims. The Millbrook community implemented several changes in response to lessons learned from Sophia's case. The school district overhauled its hiring procedures for substitute teachers and other temporary staff, implementing comprehensive background checks and reference verification that went beyond the minimal requirements previously followed. Millbrook Elementary School honored Dorothy Mitchell's memory by establishing an annual award recognizing staff members who demonstrated exceptional attention to student welfare and willingness to report concerns even when doing so proved uncomfortable or inconvenient. The Morrison property, which had played such a central role in the tragedy, was eventually demolished and the land converted to a small memorial park where families could gather and children could play in a space dedicated to Sophia's memory. Detective James Sullivan continued his law enforcement career with renewed commitment to investigating crimes against children and ensuring that cases were pursued with the thoroughness and attention to detail that had ultimately solved Sophia's disappearance. He frequently reflected on the investigation, recognizing that several fortunate circumstances had aligned to eventually identify Walsh as the perpetrator. Dorothy Mitchell's journal, forgotten for years until construction workers accidentally discovered the sealed storage room, had provided the crucial link between Walsh and the crime. The antique dealer's decision to retain boxes of papers from the storage unit auction rather than immediately discarding them had preserved evidence that directly connected Walsh to Sophia. These chance occurrences reminded Sullivan that solving crimes often required not just skilled investigation, but also elements of timing and luck that no detective could control or predict. The case also highlighted systemic weaknesses in how institutions handled concerns about potentially dangerous individuals. Dorothy Mitchell had reported her observations about Steven Walsh to school administrators, but those concerns had been dismissed rather than properly investigated or reported to law enforcement. This failure reflected broader patterns in which warning signs were ignored or rationalized because taking action seemed difficult, or because administrators feared overreacting to behavior that might have innocent explanations. In the aftermath of Sophia's case, Connecticut implemented new mandatory reporting requirements, obligating school officials to notify police when credible concerns about staff members' interactions with children were raised, ensuring that law enforcement rather than institutional administrators made decisions about whether concerning behavior warranted investigation. Each Halloween, the town of Millbrook held a memorial gathering in Sophia Carter's honor, a community event that combined remembrance of a lost child with education about child safety and the importance of vigilant protection of vulnerable young people. Parents attended with their children, using the occasion to discuss age-appropriate safety concepts and reinforce that most adults were trustworthy, but that children should always feel empowered to refuse requests that made them uncomfortable, even when those requests came from authority figures like teachers or coaches. The event concluded with a candlelight vigil during which participants stood together in silence, honoring Sophia's memory and recommitting themselves to ensuring that other children would be protected from predators who sought to exploit their innocence and vulnerability. Catherine and Robert Carter never fully recovered from their daughter's loss, a grief that permanently altered the trajectory of their lives and relationship. They eventually divorced several years after Sophia's death, unable to navigate their individual grief processes while maintaining their marriage. Both remained involved in the foundation established in their daughter's memory and continued advocating for child safety reforms, finding purpose in work that honored Sophia's legacy and potentially prevented other families from enduring similar tragedies. They maintained cordial relations focused on their shared commitment to the Foundation's mission, united by their love for their daughter and determination that her death would not be meaningless. The investigation into Sophia Carter's disappearance ultimately demonstrated both the challenges and possibilities of solving crimes against children. The case showed how predators could exploit institutional settings to identify and access victims, how they could hide in plain sight while planning calculated crimes, and how they relied on gaps in communication and oversight to avoid detection. But the case also showed that careful investigation, attention to details that others might overlook, and willingness to pursue leads, regardless of how much time had passed, could eventually bring perpetrators to justice. Most importantly, Sophia's case reinforced the critical importance of taking seriously any concerns about adults whose behavior around children raised questions, recognizing that uncomfortable conversations and potentially difficult investigations were always preferable to the alternative of allowing predators to operate unchecked until they claimed innocent victims. The lessons learned from that Halloween night in 1990 continued to influence child protection policies and practices decades later, ensuring that Sophia Carter's brief life and tragic death contributed to the safety of countless other children who would never know her name but would benefit from the changes her case had inspired.